Chapter 8. The Cardiovascular System. Introduction. The cardiovascular system consists of the heart and thousands of miles of blood vessels. The heart is the muscular pump that forces the blood through a system of vessels made of arteries, veins, and capillaries. These vessels transport the blood, which carries oxygen, nutrients, hormones, enzymes, and cellular waste to and from the trillions of cells that make up our bodies. These cells need oxygen and nutrients from digested food to make the chemical energy ATP that allows the cells to function properly. Enzymes assist in the chemical reactions inside the cells, and waste products from these reactions must be transported by the cardiovascular system to sites like the lungs and kidneys for excretion from the body. The force to transport the blood is provided by the cardiac muscle that makes up the bulk of the heart. The function of transportation of blood by the cardiovascular system occurs 24 hours a day 7 days per week, non-stop for 70, 80, or 90 years or more. This is possible because the heart beats about 72 times a minute. It is a unique organ in that it can contract, rest, and immediately contract again during our entire lifetime. The system has a series of valves that prevent blood from backflowing through the blood vessels. It is our pumping heart that helps keep us alive and healthy. The anatomy of the heart. The heart is positioned obliquely between the lungs in the mediastinum. About 2/3 of its bulk lies to the left side of the midline of the body. It is shaped like a blunt cone. It is about the size of a closed fist. It is approximately 5 inches long, 12 cm, 3.5 inches wide at its broadest, 0.9 cm, and 2.5 inches thick, 6 cm. It is enclosed in a loose-fitting serous membrane known as the pericardial sac, which can also be referred to as the parietal pericardium. The pericardial sac is made up of 2 layers. The outermost layer is the fibrous layer or fibrous pericardium. It is made of tough fibrous connective tissue and connects to the large blood vessels that enter and leave the heart, the venae cavae, aorta, pulmonary arteries, and veins to the diaphragm muscle, and to the inside of the sternal wall of the thorax. It prevents overextension of the pumping heart by acting as a tough protective membrane surrounding the heart. It also anchors the heart in the mediastinum. The innermost layer of the pericardial sac is the serous layer or serous pericardium. This layer is thin and delicate. It is continuous with the outermost layer of the wall of the heart, called the epicardium, at the base of the heart. It is also continuous with the large blood vessels of the heart and is also known as the parietal layer of the pericardial sac. As you can see, this is the position of the heart in the mediastinum between the 2 lungs. The layers of the heart wall. The outermost layer of the wall of the heart is called the epicardium or visceral pericardium. It is a thin, transparent layer composed of serous tissue and mesothelium. Because of its serous nature, it can also be called the serous pericardium of the heart. To prevent confusion with the pericardial sac's innermost layer, we will refer to it as the epicardium. Between the epicardium of the heart and the serous pericardium of the pericardial sac is a space called the pericardial cavity. This cavity contains a watery fluid called the pericardial fluid, which reduces friction and erosion of tissue between these membranes as the heart expands and contracts during a cardiac cycle. If an inflammation of the innermost layer of the pericardial sac develops, it is known as pericarditis. Because the outermost layer of the heart is the outermost layer of an organ of the body, this epicardium can also be referred to as the visceral peritoneum. Underneath the epicardium is the second layer of the wall of the heart. This makes up the bulk of the heart and is called the myocardium. This is the layer of cardiac muscle tissue. Its cells or fibers are involuntary, striated, and branched. The tissue of this layer is arranged in interlacing bundles and is the layer responsible for contraction of the heart. The third or innermost layer of the wall of the heart is called the endocardium. It is a thin layer of endothelium, the type of epithelial tissue that overlies a thin layer of connective tissue penetrated by tiny blood vessels and bundles of smooth muscle. It acts as a lining for the myocardium. It covers the valves of the heart and the chordae tendineae of the valves. As you can see, this is the layers of the pericardial sac left and the layers of the walls of the heart right. And this is walls of the heart. The chambers of the heart. The inside of the heart is divided into 4 chambers that receive blood from various parts of the body. The 2 upper chambers are called the right atrium and the left atrium. Each atrium has an external appendage called an auricle, named because of its similarity to the ear of a dog. The auricle increases the volume of the atrium. A lining of each atrium is smooth, except for the anterior atrial walls and the lining of the 2 auricles, which contain projecting muscle bundles called the musculi peritoniati that give the auricles their rough appearance. The 2 atria are separated from each other by an internal intratral septum. The lower 2 chambers are called the right ventricle and the left ventricle. The 2 ventricles are separated from one another by an internal interventricular septum. The irregular ridges and folds of the myocardium of the ventricles are called the trabeculae cardiae. The muscle tissue of the atria and ventricles is separated by connective tissue that also forms the valves. This connective tissue divides the myocardium into 2 separate muscle masses. Externally, the group called the coronary sulcus separates the atria from the ventricles. 2 other sulci plural are seen externally. The anterior interventricular sulcus and the posterior interventricular sulcus separate the right and left ventricles from one another. The sulci contain a varying amount of fat and coronary blood vessels that supply the heart tissue with blood. This is the interior of the heart. A cross-section of the heart showing the chambers, valves, septum, chordae tendineae, and vessels. The superior view of valves. The great vessels of the heart. The right atrium receives blood from all parts of the body except the lungs. It receives this blood through 3 veins. The superior vena cava, also known as the anterior vena cava, brings blood from the upper parts of the body, the head, neck, and arms. The inferior vena cava, also known as the posterior vena cava, brings blood from the lower parts of the body, the legs, and abdomen. The coronary sinus drains the blood from most of the vessels that supply the walls of the heart with blood. This blood in the right atrium is then squeezed into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the blood into the next major vessel, the pulmonary trunk, which splits into the right pulmonary artery and the left pulmonary artery. These arteries each carry the blood to a lung. In the lungs, the blood releases the carbon dioxide it has been carrying and picks up oxygen. The oxygenated blood returns to the heart via 4 pulmonary veins that empty into the left atrium. The blood is then squeezed into the left ventricle. The left ventricle pumps the blood into the next great vessel, the ascending aorta. From here the aortic blood goes to the coronary arteries, which supply the walls of the heart with oxygenated blood, the arch of the aorta, which sends arteries to upper parts of the body, and the descending thoracic aorta, which becomes the abdominal aorta. These arteries transport oxygenated blood to all parts of the body. The size of the chambers and the thickness of the chamber walls vary due to the amount of blood received and the distance this blood must be pumped. The right atrium, which collects blood coming from all parts of the body except the lungs, is slightly larger than the left atrium, which receives only the blood coming from the lungs. The thickness of the chamber walls also varies. Ventricles have thick walls, whereas the atria are thin-walled. They are assisted with pumping blood by the reduced pressure caused by the expanding ventricles as they receive the blood. The thickness of the two ventricle walls varies also. The left ventricle has walls thicker than the right ventricle, since it must pump the oxygenated blood at high pressure through thousands of miles of blood vessels in the head, trunk, and extremities. The valves of the heart. The valves of the heart are designed in such a way as to prevent blood from flowing back into the pumping chamber. There are 2 atrioventricular valves between the atria and their ventricles. The valve between the right atrium and the right ventricle is called the tricuspid valve because it consists of 3 flaps or cusps. These flaps are made of fibrous connective tissue that grows out of the walls of the heart and is covered with endocardium. The pointed ends of the cusps project down into the ventricle. Cords called chordae tendineae connect the pointed ends of the flaps or cusps to small conical projections called the papillary muscles located on the inner surface of the ventricle. The atrioventricular valve between the left atrium and the left ventricle is known as the bicuspid or mitral valve. As the name indicates, it has 2 cusps or fluid APS, whose pointed ends project down into the ventricle with the same structures as the tricuspid valve. It is the only valve in the heart with only 2 cusps. All others have 3 cusps. The 2 arteries that leave the heart, the ascending aorta and the pulmonary trunk, also have valves that prevent blood from fluid going back into the pumping chamber. These are called the semilunar valves. The pulmonary semilunar valve is found in the opening where the pulmonary trunk exits the right ventricle. The aortic semilunar valve is found in the opening where the ascending aorta leaves the left ventricle. Both of the valves are made of 3 semilunar cusps that allow blood to flow only in one direction. Blood flow through the heart. As we discuss blood flow through the heart, it is easier to study its path by beginning at one point, going in a one-way direction, and ending at the same point we began. We will do this, but remember, the heart actually pumps the blood in a slightly different manner. That is, the 2 atria contract simultaneously, while the 2 ventricles relax. Then the 2 ventricles contract simultaneously, while the 2 atria relax. Then all chambers rest before the cycle begins again. The oxygenated blood high in carbon dioxide gas returns from the upper portions of the body through the superior or anterior vena cava and from the lower portions of the body through the inferior or posterior vena cava to the right atrium of the heart. The blood is then squeezed by contraction of the right atrium through the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle. As the right ventricle contracts, it pumps the blood through the pulmonary semilunar valve into the pulmonary trunk, which branches into the right pulmonary artery that goes to the right lung and the left pulmonary artery that goes to the left lung. In the alveoli of the lungs surrounded by capillaries, the blood loses the carbon dioxide gas and picks up oxygen. The oxygenated blood looks dark, hence, veins are usually depicted in textbooks as blue. Oxygenated blood looks bright red, hence, arteries are usually shown in red in textbooks. The oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium of the heart through four pulmonary veins. When the left atrium contracts, it squeezes the blood through the bicuspid or mitral valve into the left ventricle. As this ventricle with its thick muscular walls contracts, it pushes the blood through the aortic semilunar valve into the ascending aorta. The ascending aorta distributes the oxygenated blood to all parts of the body. This is the schematic drawing of blood flow through the heart showing pulmonary and systemic circulation. The conduction system of the heart. The heart is innervated by the autonomic nervous system. However, it does not initiate a contraction but only increases or decreases the time it takes to complete the cardiac cycle. This is made possible because the heart has its own intrinsic regulating system called the conduction system that generates and distributes electrical impulses over the heart to stimulate cardiac muscle fibers or cells to contract. The system begins at the sinoatrial node, known as the SA node or pacemaker, which initiates each cardiac cycle and sets the pace for the heart rate. It is located in the superior wall of the right atrium. It can be modified by nerve impulses from the autonomic nervous system. Sympathetic impulses will speed it up, and parasympathetic impulses will restore or slow it down. Thyroid hormone and epinephrine carried by the blood will also affect the pacemaker. Once an impulse is initiated by the SA node, the impulse spreads out over both atria, causing them to contract simultaneously. At the same time, it depolarizes the atrioventricular AV node. It is located in the lower portion of the right atrium. From the AV node, a tract of conducting fibers called the atrioventricular bundle or bundle of His runs through the cardiac mass to the top of the interventricular septum. It then branches and continues down both sides of the septum as the right and left bundle branches. Thus, the bundle of His distributes the electrical charge over the medial surfaces of the ventricles. The actual contraction of the ventricles is stimulated by the Purkinje fibers, also known as the conduction myofibrils that emerge from the bundle branches and pass into the cells of the myocardium of the ventricles. This is the conduction system of the heart.